Hello, everybody. This is Mike Hare, and you're listening to the All Metal Mode podcast with myself and Mr. Dorian Cook. And I believe we have a really good show for you tonight. Dorian is going to be talking about archaeology versus metal detecting, and he has extensive knowledge on this topic. I'm going to be hanging back. I will be here. Obviously listening in and commenting when and where I can. But it should be a great, it should be. I know it'll be a great show. It's always a good time when Dorian goes off on something he's passionate and knowledgeable about. I always have fun on these shows. Before we get started, there are a few things I wanted to mention. A couple really cool things. Well, something really cool, and I think I'd already told Dorian about this. Joanna, so she's kind of my partner on, well, she helps out a bunch on the website. She helps do the logos and stuff like that, social media. She's been a huge help, and I think she wrote one other article. She's interested in writing a few articles. She wrote an article called "Dear Person Giving Me the Stink Eye While I'm Metal Detecting." That article went viral, and it made it on the Google news page or homepage, whatever. And I'm so proud of her. She hasn't written a lot of articles in metal detecting. She's very passionate about it. She's very behind the scenes. But congratulations to Joanna. If you want to check it out, it's on, just go to allmetalmode.com and you'll find it. And Dirt Digest, we are always looking for articles, find submissions. I know they posted, I think just a few hours ago, in Dirt Digest magazine on Facebook. There's a giveaway for the best find submitted this month, so get those in. You've got a few more days. They don't have to be current. Let us know if you found it earlier or months ago or something, or even a couple years ago. You know, if you can provide a little bit of story, give us a little bit of information. A paragraph or two is fine. But there is a contest through Dirt Digest magazine on Facebook. Something else I want to talk about, and this is completely just my opinion, my thoughts on it. I do not represent anybody else on the podcast or anything like that. I caught wind of it yesterday. Somebody said that they were at a park and a guy was using a Nocta Macro simplex. And I guess he was using a White's V3i. He'd walk back to his vehicle, grab his camera and his simplex, and go out and film. And the story was told like they were faking it. They were finding it with their V3i and then going out and filming with their simplex. This guy was metal detecting, who wrote this, and said the guy kept looking over at him like he was being suspicious. And I just want to say, whether it's true or not, I'm very disappointed that somebody would do that and write about it. Here's the thing. What if that guy was using the White's V3i, he just got the simplex and he wanted to see how it compared, and was open and honest in the video he was doing. And either way, it's none of your business. And I feel like if you're going to make that kind of accusation, take a picture of the guy doing it. Take a small video. We all have smartphones now. The thing that even upset me more, I read it where, how I saw it was a team member of, let's just leave it at that, a team member of a manufacturer reposting that. And I think without evidence of really knowing what was going on and stuff, I think that's sad and tragic. I think it's wrong. I hate to see that kind of drama in the hobby. People, individuals trying to put down other brands and manufacturers. I've left a lot of groups because of that. I remember when the AT Max come out, another manufacturer group was just giving them a hard time. I remember when other detectors come out and other, manufacturer groups. I'm not saying the manufacturers, it was their group. I'm saying somebody who had started, an individual who had started a group on a specific manufacturer, posting that kind of stuff. I just think that's absurd. And I think the people who shared that and brought it up, I think they should be ashamed of themselves. I'm really disappointed to see people in the hobby acting like that. Okay, that's my rant. I'm over it. I apologize, Dorian. It's been on my mind.
No, it's okay.
It's stuff like that really, keeps me away from Facebook. You and I were just talking about that before we went live, and I hate to see the drama and the people bickering and the brand loyalty and the fighting and bickering back and forth from it, the accusations, all that is absurd.
That's why, we chose to keep all commercialism off of our group page, and it's really, really worked. Everybody keeps saying that they love the page because they can come there and they can talk back and forth, without having to argue about whose detector is best or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing before we get started, before I turn it over to Dorian tonight, again, the topic is archaeology versus metal detecting. No, that's not the topic, is it? That isn't how we worded it, was it?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Archaeology versus metal detecting. He's Dorian. Boy, is there a good show in store for you. Dorian covered some of the stuff with me he's going to go over. Something I want to tell everybody, when we do these shows where Dorian talks, where he's very knowledgeable on the subject and I'm not, and I'm hanging back, and Dorian will say something to me and there's a pause, I want you guys to know I'm listening, I'm into it. I am on mute, so all you're hearing is Dorian. So it takes me a second to get back. I don't want anybody to think that I'm not paying attention or anything like that. I love when Dorian talks about the things that he's very knowledgeable about. And just bear with me to chime back in. I got to pull myself off of mute. So, last thing I want to do is him to be talking and you guys listening to my background noise. So, Dorian, take it away. Yeah, I'm putting George to sleep, so let's go ahead and get you started.
Is George with us tonight?
Yeah, he is.
Oh, hey, you old geezer. Greetings from another old geezer. Hey, okay. Mike wanted me to cover one thing related to something that just happened with one of our group members before I get into the archaeology versus metal detecting. And we'll take but a moment. It's almost a little embarrassing because it'll sound like I'm tooting my own horn, but I am excited about this. For those of you that follow the All Metal Mode page, you probably saw a post I did where I was telling how to find Civil War belt buckles and cartridge box plates and breastplates and things. And I was giving some tips. And one of the tips I gave in the post was that if you're hunting a camp on level ground and it falls off into a steep slope at the edges, like maybe it's up on a ridge top or a mountain, then you definitely want to go down on that steep slope because when buckles would break, a lot of times, like a hook broke, if they knew they could go to the quartermaster and get a replacement, right away, they may not throw that buckle into the fire pit. They might walk over to the edge and see how far they could throw it. Because a lot of the soldiers were young, they were still in their teens even, and they still had some boy in them, and it was just kind of a thing where go out there and see how far you can fling that old belt buckle or plate because it's heavy, it's got lead in it, it feels good in your hand to throw. You could skip one on the water if you were down by a creek, for example, and they did. So I said, go over the slope, because not only did they throw belt buckles, but they threw away other things too. It was a natural dumping site. So one of our members, Gary Persinger, that was on the podcast 2 or 3 weeks ago, Gary decided to try that advice, and he was hunting a Confederate camp up in the mountains of central West Virginia, and it was a flat area, but it had a steep slope on one side. So he went down on that slope, and he found a complete Confederate musket. Everything except the wood. Of course, the wood was gone after all these years, and it was just barely under the leaves. It was obvious that somebody had flung the musket down the hill, just like I was talking about. In this case, we didn't know why they threw the musket away, but in cleaning it, he discovered that about halfway down the barrel is a mini bullet sticking, looking at him, the nose of it. And it's very, very probable that there are other mini balls behind it. They had a little battle at that camp, and it looks like this is one of those cases where the soldier went into what's called loading shock. A lot of times new soldiers experiencing combat for their first time would go into this kind of a stupor state, and they would just start loading bullets into their gun without firing. And at Gettysburg, for example, they found one gun barrel had 23 bullets in it. So anyway, the fact that it's got a bullet in it and probably more, and Gary will have to take it to a university where they can x-ray it for him, and that's how he'll find out if there's other bullets in the gun. But even if it's just the one, it quadruples the collective value of that relic find, because it's so unusual. So everybody's real excited, and we're all happy for Gary. I'm like a father with a new kid almost. I'm feeling a little pride that a piece of my advice paid off.
Hey, Dorian, yeah. I want to jump in. I apologize.
Sure.
A couple things. I know you were kind of embarrassed to share that, but I think people, especially with YouTube, are getting such bad information, and there's really not a lot of good. Something I love about you, you've been metal detecting for 40 some years, I believe, correct?
48.
Yeah. And you're very humble. You're still learning. You tell me you're still learning. We talk about, how we're still learning, and some of these people. So, I love that, and that you, when you share your knowledge, is amazing. But I want to tell you, as you're telling the story, George said that he has a friend that used to skip breastplates across the pond.
Wow.
and he said if he was at if he found out he was at a Union camp, he would leave. Yeah. So and George has been at a long time, and then wow. George just said that Corey goes to the same detector shop that George hangs out at.
Really?
Yeah. How cool is that?
I guess we'll have to throw him out of the group then. Oh, yeah. No kidding.
Okay, I'll let you back at it, but I wanted to chime in with all that. I thought that was all really cool.
That's the thing. One of the things I love about metal detecting, you never hear all the stories. Everybody's got stories, and I love that one, George, and I'll share it with the group, and they're going to crack up over it. We can't even imagine somebody actually skipping real breastplates that they find across the pond, because they're Yankee. Boy, right. You talk about an unreconstructed rebel. Wow.
Yeah. Right. Well, I imagine him coming into a Union camp and tired of digging belt plates, Union belt plates, and skipping them across the pond. He's so tired of finding them, like when we find a soda can in the ground or something.
Yeah. I guess so.
Yeah.
Well, that's of course they did things back in the days. If most of the people listening were to go if I were to take them on a Civil War battle site, and they found a piece of exploded cannonball, they would be thrilled, and it would be a treasured artifact. They'd clean it up, and display it proudly. Port Hudson, where they had a siege for 49 days, and the Union Army surrounded Port Hudson. It had a 2-mile perimeter of dirt walls around a little village, and on the Mississippi River on one side, it had a big dirt fort. But the Federals bombarded it with 50,000 artillery shells for 49 days. and there were 40% of those were duds. So in other words, the whole shell was still there in the ground. And so it was like the number one shell hunting battlefield in the whole United States, I think. And I found my first 12-pound cannonball there 4 feet deep. And then I dug a 20-pound parrot shell and a 30-pound parrot shell all in one day and had some real adventures. But anyway, the point I wanted to make real quick on that. Now, what was the point? I know there was a point in there somewhere. Oh man, I just went blank on that. How embarrassing.
Well, we were talking about all the, how back then, like in my mind, he's wading through belt plates and throwing them because he's finding so many of the.
Oh yeah. Thank you. I got it back. Yeah. Okay. My point is, you go into the woods there to hunt cannonballs and artillery shells, and here would be pyramids of big pieces of exploded cannonball, stacked by other relic hunters in the woods. And these pyramids were like 3 feet high and maybe 3 foot or 4 foot square at the base. Solid pieces of shrapnel. They wouldn't even carry the shrapnel out of the woods there. And yet now every piece of that would be prized artifacts. So you see how times change.
Right. Yep, that's crazy.
Okay. Well, are we ready to get into?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yep. All right. Let me. This is a controversial subject, so let me just kind of do a general disclaimer here at the beginning and say that my purpose in the comments I'm going to make is not to totally excoriate all archaeologists or try to paint them as bad people and forever our irrevocable enemies, but I am going to shine the spotlight of truth on their frequent failures to be the protectors and preservers of important history that they pride themselves on. And I'm going to show very clearly from the evidence that they are not, or the abuse that they've heaped on us is not justified as a general group. Perhaps there's no perhaps. There are isolated individuals who deserve that abuse to be called grave robbers and things like that, but not the great mass of metal detectorists. Now, when I listen to somebody speaking on a subject I'm interested in, I want to know what their credentials are. I want to know why they're qualified to do that. Why am I then qualified to speak on the subject of archaeology versus metal detecting? Well, it just turns out that, the path that I chose in life in younger years, just took me in a direction that I ended up in a very small minority of metal detectorists that have worked closely with professional archaeologists on major projects. And I've done it both in this country and in Israel, and I'll be talking about some of those. But I have been up close and personal with the, whatever you want to call it, the profession, the science of archaeology, and I've seen the good and the bad and the downright ugly when it comes to this subject. So I want to tell you how this all began. We'll go back to the beginning. Way back in 1972, I got my first metal detector. I had just started my own business, a landscape construction business in Dallas, and I was primarily working for wealthy people. And I started coin detecting. Wasn't even thinking about relic hunting. I lived there in a small middle class neighborhood in Dallas, and we hunted. I started out hunting the parks and the school ground. I mean, the houses, the parks, the school grounds, and back then did pretty well. But I'd always had an interest in the Civil War. And my wife was actually from an area in Kentucky where there had been quite a bit of Civil War action. So on one of our visits back, taking her back to visit with her family, in 1977, 5 years after I started metal detecting, I drove over to the Perryville State Park battlefield. Didn't know very much about the battle. Didn't understand how big it was. Didn't know there was, in reality, probably somewhere around 10,000 casualties. It was one of the 20 biggest battles of the Civil War. I had no idea of any of that because I was not a Civil War researcher yet. But I thought, okay, if I get on the battlefield and metal detect, I should be able to find a few bullets or artifacts or something. So I didn't even know my first venture into relic hunting was illegal. I did not know you were not allowed to use a metal detector even at that early date of 1977 in Kentucky state parks. And to make matters worse, of all the places I could have chosen to start hunting, I chose to start hunting right behind the ranger station and the park museum, right in plain sight, out in the big old pasture, right in plain sight of everybody. And I had not been hunting long when two rangers came out, and they stood there and they watched me metal detect for about 20 minutes. And I carefully filled my holes and everything. And after 20 minutes, they walked back into the ranger station. They didn't stop me, even though they saw me clearly. They watched me for 20 minutes. They made no attempt to enforce the law on me. And I found one bullet, and I found one little iron canister shot from a cannon that day, and I was forever hooked on relic hunting from that day on. But it was only later that I would find out I'd actually committed an illegal act, and I'm very grateful for the mercy those rangers showed me, because they could have made big trouble for me. So, not all authorities and officials are bad or mean or nasty, but that was how I got into relic hunting. Now, as I got into it, and the reason I told you this, I began to hear comments at different groups, activities, hunts, and things went on. People were talking clubs that I visited. By 77, I'd been working for Charles Garrett for a year, and I was doing some traveling and speaking about metal detecting, about our metal detectors to various clubs around the country. And I began hearing about how the archaeologists basically called us as a group, we were called grave robbers. That they assumed, that all of us were perfectly willing to defile, the sanctity of someone's grave just to get a belt buckle or a Confederate button or so whatever that might be in the grave with the soldier. And there certainly have been individuals who have done that. But I've met an awful lot, hundreds of relic hunters, and I could count on all 10 fingers and have fingers left over the ones that I ever knew, even when we got around the campfires at midnight, nobody listening that ever admitted to having dug a grave. And I certainly, in the course of my discovery and recovery of over 14,000 Civil War artifacts on 140 sites, I never dug anybody's grave. Now, I did, on a retreat path, I did metal detect an empty grave, and I knew the soldier wasn't in there. It was obvious the grave had already been opened because the Yankee Army had come back, dug up the soldiers they had to bury on the retreat, and they put them in national cemeteries. So I did detect the grave, and I found that soldier's pocket knife in the grave, and that's the closest I ever came to being a grave robber, but there wasn't any robbery involved in that. I had permission to detect there and everything. And anyway, I was disturbed by that. It didn't seem fair. I guess it would have been easier, not quite so insulting. They'd said, "Well, you're artifact destroyers, or you're artifact thieves, or something." Grave robber was just really a low insult in my book. So, it did not make me kindly supposed to the archaeological community. But anyway, I wasn't really, I didn't have any axe to grind per se with the federal archaeologists, and historians. And I understood the need to protect the big battlefields and things. So I really wasn't, like I said, I wasn't an automatic enemy of the archaeologists. Now, I had a speaking assignment. I had to go to Northern Virginia and speak to the Northern Virginia Relic Hunters Club as the Garrett rep. And it was a big club back then. And they had nearly 500 members. And I think it grew to much bigger before. I don't know how big they are now because I lost contact. But I gave my presentation, and after the meeting, a man came up to me whose first name was Jerry, and that's all I'm going to give over the air because I don't even want even a ghost a chance of causing him a problem if he's still alive. But he had an interesting job. He told me about. He had been the manager for a Parks Department, Department of the Interior property room for 6 years. And what this property room's purpose was, it was for the storage of donated Civil War artifact collections from private citizens to the U.S. government. Now, when the donations were made, a lot of them were donated upon death, but it had been assumed by the owners of these collections that if they donated these to the federal government, they would end up displayed in a museum and taken care of. And they decided that was the best course of action for their collections when they were gone. Jerry told me that he saw hundreds of collections, and he said many of them were absolutely outstanding, full of rare and unusual Civil War artifacts, guns, belt buckles, everything you can imagine. Well, he said in the entire 6 years that not one of those hundreds of collections ever went in to a U.S. museum. He said they were all given to senators and congressmen and visiting foreign dignitaries. It had poisoned his mind against the federal government. He was so quietly outraged that the American public had no idea this was going on. He quit a very good job with the federal government, and he actually became an outlaw relic hunter because he said that he wanted to take back or to discover to keep the government from getting their hands on as many Civil War artifacts as possible because of the corruption that he saw within the system. Now, I'm just telling you his story, all right? I can't personally verify that it was true. I do believe it was true. He took me aside. He told me very quietly he was not a loud person. He wasn't seeking recognition or anything from me other than he wanted to share the story with me. Well, anyway, that put me on alert. And I've learned about a lot of things that are going on inside the government, not only our government, but I saw the same thing in the Israeli government when I worked over there in archaeology, and I'll have some comments a little later on that. The corruption is it's there, folks. I don't want to condemn everybody, who's in government service, certainly not. But I want to say that there is corruption because these artifacts have value. And I'm going to show you how not just short-sighted thinking, but corruption has done far, far more damage to preserving the history of our country than the metal detectorists will ever do, even if they were trying. I can tell you this, Jerry was a low-key person, but he got very passionate. And I still remember his face turning red and his ears as he was telling me when we got to the part about how all these collections had been given away. And it was certainly not the people who donated them. Had they known the fate of those collections, would have never done it, I'm sure. So anyway, that, like I said, put me on alert, and I started to investigate. And then I discovered what I called the first chink in the federal archaeologist's armor. Now, all of you, the great majority of you listening to my voice have seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Okay. Do you remember the last scene where they're pushing the ark that's on a dolly in a crate, and they're pushing it down this big aisleway in this giant warehouse that's stacked it's about 3 or 4 stories high, and it's stacked to the ceiling with other crates. I think everybody will probably remember that. Well, that is an actual government warehouse. They have a whole bunch of those in the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River. And they're longer than a football field, and I think they're about 4 stories high. And many, many, many of them are stacked to the ceiling. And some of those contain Civil War artifacts. You see, when the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that the President Roosevelt got going to help the country pull out of a bad depression, put men back to work. When they built the national parks, the national military parks, built the roads and the stone walls and the bridges and the museums, or the park headquarters buildings. Well, they built all of that in the process of, clearing sections of wood, putting it back into pasture like it was when the battle was fought, things like that. And, of course, grading out the roads. They unearthed hundreds of thousands of Civil War artifacts. That's not, it's not like a great secret, but it's a piece of information that very few younger people would even know today that get into relic hunting. Well, those relics are still packed away in crates in those warehouses since that time, since the 1940s. And some of those relics, they were discovered before I was born. And nothing's been done. Nothing's been done to preserve them other than maybe control the humidity in the building. They've not been taken out of the crates unwrapped, and the process of rust stopped. They haven't. There are no plans. They're not in museums. They're not planned for museums. There are no plans in place. For one thing, the money is not there to do the preservation work, and the museum space is not there to display them. And there are no plans to build those museums. And it points up a problem at the federal level that actually exists through the whole archaeological community. And the fact is, there's not I don't know if there's 1%, but I'll be generous and say there's not more than 2% of the funding available that's needed to preserve all the known archaeological sites and the artifacts in them. And there are no plans to change that. And if the money was there, there's not enough people to do the job. There's not enough archaeologists. But they're too proud to admit that. They can't handle what they've got on their plate. And yet they want to scream at anybody that digs a Civil War bullet off a battlefield. Now, I'm using the Civil War in my examples. Now, I said the title is Archeology versus Metal Detecting, and it does. But the relic hunters get impacted really, really hard by the laws and by the federal government and the archaeologists. So I'm kind of using them as an example of things that I've witnessed and what's going on there. But I want to present you more evidence of how badly the archaeological community is letting their ego and their vanity blind them to their failure to preserve a very large portion of the great artifacts that flesh out our noble history. Now, I can get pretty passionate about this. In the late 70s, some of the clubs and relic hunters in Texas, and I'll have to say, Texas has been it's one of the leader states in trying to do projects like this. And, Keith Wells has been a big factor in fighting for the rights of metal detectors and this type of thing. But some of the clubs and the relic hunters reached out to the state of Texas in the late 70s, and they offered free help. And I'm going to, for the sake of not stumbling over the word, I'm going to call the archaeologists Archies. So you know what I'm talking about if I say Archies. So they offered free help to the Archies on their projects. And a man with great foresight, a man with common sense, a man who was the head archaeologist of the state of Texas, of the Texas Antiquities Commission, J. Bartow Arnold, accepted. He was the first archaeologist to accept the help that we offered. And there was a club in Houston called the Houston Research and Recovery Club, and I was a member. I lived in Dallas, about 240 miles away, but I knew a lot of the people in the club, and I would, in Texas, driving 245 miles is just a Sunday drive because the distances are so great out there between cities and things. It's a whole different thing than from here in Kentucky when you're driving from one major city to another. Anyway, one of the first important projects that J. Bartow Arnold asked for help from our club was, everybody knows about the Alamo. And there was another battle called San Jacinto. The Spanish would say San Jacinto. But San Jacinto is the way the Texans say it, so we'll stick with that. And there was a big massacre of Texans by after they'd surrendered by Santa Anna and his troops there. No, I'm sorry. I'm getting a little bit confused. I'm thinking of Goliad. San Jacinto is where Sam Houston and the Texans got their revenge and captured Santa Anna and defeated his entire army that had done battle at the Alamo. So it was a very, very important battlefield for Texas history. And the Houston club went all out. They got red caps and bright red golf shirts that, with big screen printed on the backs, Houston Research and Recovery Club. And they look good, too, everybody. Men and women out there. There must have been somewhere between a dozen and 20 people that assisted. And we went on the battlefield, and in one day, we tripled all the artifacts from that battle that had been found since it took place back in the 1830s. And of course, Jay Bartow was thrilled, and we were in like Flint, as they say. He used us on a number of different projects, and everyone was successful, and everyone resulted in far more artifacts recovered far more quickly and at far less expense than they ever had been able to do before, thanks to the detectorists. And that's a piece of evidence right there. See, if the archaeological community had an open mind, they would have latched onto that and say, wow, here's a chance to supplement our budgets. We don't have enough money to do these digs and things, and these people will come and help us for nothing. But you know what their attitude was? Oh, no, keep them away from our sites because they'll steal something. You know what? If you had 20 people there and one person or two pocketed a coin, you'd still come out way ahead on both money and time and the number of artifacts recovered. I wanted to show you how small their thinking is. And they deserve to have that exposed publicly. So I make no apologies to them for that. Shame on you, archaeological community. Shame on you. Now, we continued on until we had our biggest challenge, a joint project involving the San Antonio Museum, the State of Texas Antiquities Commission, and the federal government. It was to take place on the Padre Island National Seashore, which is just the same as a national park. No metal detecting allowed. Everybody knows about the plate fleet, Spanish plate fleet that wrecked off the coast of Florida, but there was also one that wrecked off the coast of Texas, off of Padre Island, back in the mid-1700s. I want to say 1740s, but I'm shooting from the hip there. I did not look it up. I'm just trying to go by memory on that. Date is not all that important to the point I want to make here. Anyway, there was a wreck offshore, and in this particular place, and the Spanish set up a what they call a salvors camp. They tried to salvage as much of the gold and silver on the ship as they could do with their primitive diving because it was in relative shallow water. So this was the camp, it was their headquarters, and we were asked to help metal detect that camp and find artifacts from the salvors being there. So we got involved, and of course the federal government was involved. So we had to sign a big contract. All the I's had to be dotted and all the T's had to be crossed, and we had to sign liability waivers and all this kind of stuff. And so we had about a dozen of us from the Houston club, and we were all wearing our uniforms, and we expected, another successful dig. We really did. We wanted to show off our stuff to the federal government. Here's a chance to show the feds what we can do. Well, they took us out to the island in a boat, and I still remember the name of it. It was a National Park Service boat called the Anomaly. And little did I know, but that name really applied to the two rangers running the boat, as you're going to see. We got out to the site, and we had with us Dr. Herman Smith, the head of the San Antonio Museum, who had never worked with metal detectorists. Never. Well, J. Bartow Arnold was there. Of course, he had, and he knew what we were capable of, and he trusted us. He never looked at us suspiciously, never accused anybody. He just gave us open trust, and we never violated that trust. I'm sure there wasn't a single member that ever violated that trust. So we get out there, and we start hunting the salvors camp, and our job was to find a signal and put a surveyor's flag, the little wire flags with a little red square on top of them. Well, they gave us those, and we flagged 60 signals in less than 2 hours. And then Jay Bartow and Herman Smith and a couple of assistants would do the digging. They would excavate. And I think all but 2 or 3 of those 60 signals turned out to be artifacts from the salvors camp. Well, at the end of 2 hours, we had made a complete convert of Dr. Herman Smith. He was elated. He was thrilled with what we had accomplished in 2 hours, and he just raved on and on, and about how he wanted to use us for future projects and so on. So we're thinking, hey, this is going really well. Everybody's happy. We're having a great time. It's fun to be involved in such a historical project. And here's the 2 park rangers over there standing on the edge watching this whole thing. And they've got their Smokey Bear hats on and their green uniforms. And they're murmuring to each other. And I'm looking over and I'm thinking, uh-oh, I see trouble coming. And sure enough, they come walking over. And they were so worried that one of us was going to find a Spanish coin off that ship and stick it in our pocket that they canceled the whole dig in violation of the contract we had made, loaded us up on the boat, and hauled us back to the mainland immediately. Herman Smith, Dr. Smith, got livid. He turned red, and I was worried he was going to blow a blood vessel or something. He got so angry. And so did J. Bartow Arnold. And they unloaded on those 2 rangers, and the rangers didn't care. They were going to do what they wanted to because they represented the federal government. Now, I tell you this story because I need to give everybody listening to this, especially you younger people that might be ever tempted to metal detect on any kind of federal property. I'm talking about a military base, a national forest, a national wildlife refuge, a national monument, anything that has the word national in it that's federal. You need this warning. Oral agreements, oral permissions from park superintendents or people in authority or park rangers, or written agreements with the federal government aren't worth the paper they're written on. I had a federal agent tell me, you have to keep your share, your side of the agreement. We don't. So it's just not worth the risk to try to make agreements. And if you find out, right now, I know where treasure sites are in national forests within, a few miles of me, actually. I know where silver mines are in national forests. And I can't do a thing legally. I can't do it. because if I go make an agreement, they're going to let me show. They're going to wait until I show them where these things are, and then you know what they're going to do? They're going to cancel the agreement and throw me out of the park. Threaten. They'll threaten me with prosecution if I come back. I know how this works, people. I really, really do. So please listen to me on this. And you need to know that ARPA is what we call the Archaeological Resources and Protection Act of 1979. That's the one that really put the hurting on us. And according to the fine print, if you are caught on a piece of federal ground, federally owned park, ground, prairie, whatever, with a metal detector, and I'll go even. Let me make it a little bit more dramatic here because this is true. If you're caught with a broken metal detector in your car with no batteries on you, inside a national park or on a piece of federal property, you could be prosecuted just as though you were out there with a working metal detector digging coins and artifacts. You cannot even legally carry a broken metal detector across a piece of federal property. So please be extra careful. If you have to drive through a part of a national forest or whatever, make sure your metal detector is down on the floor of the back seat and covered with a blanket. Don't leave any part of it exposed in case you get stopped and they look in your car. They're probably not going to search it, but they might look through the windows. And if they see a metal detector laying there, you could be subject to prosecution. And on a first offense, you can get 2 years in prison, a federal prison, and you can get a $5,000 fine. I'm considered a professional because I've been published in the magazines. I've written books on Civil War relic hunting and battles and things. And I'm considered a professional. And if I'm caught on a piece of federal property, I can get 10 years in prison on the first offense and a $100,000 fine. And I haven't told you the really bad stuff. Now they can enact the civilian confiscation laws against you, and they can come take your bank accounts, your cars, your house. They can take it all and leave you with nothing, not even, no money to pay a lawyer because they've taken everything you had. And they can do that now since 9/11 without filing charges. They can keep you tied up for years and never file charges on you and not give your things back to you and not give your money back to you. And so far, the record is that when civilian confiscation has been used against private citizens, less than 10% have ever been able to get anything that was taken back, and the ones that did had to spend over $45,000 in lawyer fees. So I hope you can see what we're up against when it gets to the federal level. It's not near as bad if you get caught in a state park or something, but you don't even want to do that because that gives the whole, all of us, it reflects on all of us and gives us bad publicity. Now, I want to get back on the archaeological thing. Let me move my notes up here. Okay, now, I think we older folks here, George Kinsey, I know you're listening there. George would agree with me on this. Common sense gets things done efficiently, and it keeps people alive. Common sense always exercises safety when looking at a situation, and that keeps people alive and uninjured. And its use results in all kinds of good things happening. But when it is sorely lacking in any individual or organization, as it is in the archaeological community, with all too few exceptions, those individuals and organizations fail to complete their assigned missions, both on a daily basis and overall in their whole career. Now, I want to give you an example of common sense in regards to the location and recovery of Civil War artifacts. The American Civil War was the first war this country engaged in to be documented by both extensive writing of books and other records such as training manuals for the troops, thousands of photographs and detailed drawings uh, as well of battle and camp situations and the weapons and uniforms. They were all made and preserved. So because of this, the artifacts recovered from the soil by digs or detectorists are not as important. Now, I didn't say they're not important, but they're not as important to understanding that war and accurately preserving its history as they were in earlier wars, because we didn't have the records. And a lot of times you had to dig the artifacts to get an idea of what really happened in a battle. Excuse me. Let me grab a drink of water right quick. So the age of communications had begun. You know, the telegraph had been invented by the time the Civil War came. The phone wouldn't be far behind, just a few years. So the age of communication begun by the time the Civil War started, and no war in history, now listen to me, no war in history had ever been documented more when it was all over. So the Archies argument that we are destroying knowledge important to understanding this war by digging artifacts, which they already have hundreds of thousands more than they can study, preserve, and display, well, that argument's just not very convincing. The idea that detectorists are going to irreparably damage the historical record of that war by unsupervised discovery and digging of its artifacts is sheer nonsense. Now, I'm not saying that, metal detectors should go in and dig around all the famous landmarks on all the national battlefields and all that kind of thing. They've got more, the Archies have got more than they can handle just to do all the archaeological work that's necessary. If you took the Battle of Gettysburg and you got every federal and state archaeologist in the whole United States and put them on Gettysburg, they could not finish the archaeological work that could be done there in their lifetimes. That's just one battle. There are 22,000 known skirmishes and battles of various sizes that happened in the Civil War. The Archies can't get, if they could do 10%, that would be a great improvement, but they can't. They just can't. You can't archaeologically dig a battlefield. The artifacts are spread over, like Perryville, over about 3,000 acres. And the park there is 1,000 acres. How do you do an archaeological dig on 1,000 acres? The only possible way to get any archaeological information out of an area that big, besides after you dug the 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 most important spots on that 3,000 acres, is to get metal detectors involved. Metal detectors can change history. They can actually sometimes do a better job of telling the story of what happened on that battlefield than the Archies can. A good example is the Custer battlefield. Keith Wills was involved in this. Some years back, they had prairie fire burn off the battlefield. And in a rare act of foresight and common sense, the park officials involved got a metal detector group to help them. They went out and detected Last Stand Hill, in the places where the battle was supposed to have taken place. And one of the things that the metal detectors did, and they corrected, and they gave us understanding about why Custer's men were so easily wiped out. Well, Custer's men were using single-shot rolling block rifles. They were called 45-70s. They used a big long bullet. And when they shoved a bullet in to the gun, if for some reason the bullet didn't fire when the firing pin hit the back of the cartridge like it's supposed to, they had to open this block, the breech, and they had to get out their pocket knife, and they had to pry that bad bullet out of the gun before they could load another. Well, they found dozens and dozens of these bullets in the area of the hottest part of the fighting that had firing pin marks in them, which means the soldiers had attempted to fire them. The Indians had just gotten several wagon loads of brand new Winchester repeating rifles, and that's what they were using in the battle, the ones that were armed with guns, versus these soldiers had these single-shot rifles. And this is well after the Civil War. This is, 1872 or somewhere around in there. And they could have had Henrys, which fired 18 shots without reloading, and they were a very dependable gun. But the bean counters at the federal government said, no, they waste too much ammunition. So these guys had to go up against the Indians armed with, excuse me, sometimes get Winchesters and Henrys confused. Anybody out there know how many rounds a Winchester held?
Hey, Dorian, real quick, while we're waiting on that before we get too far ahead, or before we get past the question, okay. Bill in Ohio said, have you ever heard of the feds, archaeologists, keeping anyone from digging on their own private property?
I'm going to get into that.
Okay, cool.
Tell him it's on the agenda.
Okay, good deal. Nobody's replied yet on that question. You just
okay. Well, anyway, we all know that it was a repeating rifle. It held at least 8 shots, maybe 9 with one in the chamber. Don't remember. That's not important. But the point is that the poor soldiers didn't stand a chance, and that was all brought to light by the recovery of these bad bullets with the firing pin marks in them by the metal detectors. Now, the archaeologists, taking that piece of information they didn't have before, they investigated and found out that the bandoliers that the soldiers had been tanned on the wrong side, which allowed the acids, the tanning acids, to get into their bullets and foul the powder. And that's why they had so many bullets that didn't fire during the battle, which, of course, greatly aided the Indians in completely wiping them out. So there's an example of what what metal detectors can do for not only for archaeologists but for improving the historical knowledge of an important event. Now we'll get into this thing. This covers what Bill's question was there. What I'm going to get into now. Now the archaeologists have been doing this probably since back in the 90s, at least, maybe the 80s. Or the federal park rangers, and usually there's at least one archaeologist connected to 2 of the big battlefield parks. They went to the farmers and landowners that had property that abutted the national military parks, came right up to the boundaries. And I'm told that they used intimidational and what the legal eagles would call prejudicial comments. In other words, they're telling the landowners how bad we relic hunters are and how we're grave robbers and how we are, not to be trusted, and we might end up stealing something that belongs to the farmers and all this stuff, and damaging their, equipment or fences or whatever. And so the whole point was they worked hard to get the landowners not to allow relic hunting by detectorists on their properties. Now, the park archaeologists, if they weren't directly involved in doing this, the rangers that did it had their blessings. So they're just as guilty. And most of the landowners comply with the rangers' wishes. A few of them don't like being told what to do with the federal government, resisted. But it has been a major problem. Now, let me tell you what the result of this is. We talked about common sense. I want you to see if you can find any common sense in this story of what happened. The result of this policy is that the metal artifacts under their farm soil continue to suffer the ravages caused by corrosive farm chemicals, petroleum-based fertilizers, and time. Iron continued to rust, and brass objects experienced accelerated rates of corrosion. And then you add to that the physical damage caused by farm plows, discs, and what they call subsoilers. It's like a big arrowhead-shaped plow that goes down in the ground about a foot and breaks it up when there's hard ground. All of these things do damage. You can go do a Google search on Civil War belt buckles and look at the pictures of dug belt buckles, and you will see the scratches across them made by discs. One of the greatest enemies of these artifacts. So every time that this was done, and they didn't start this no-till farming until a few years ago. So for many, many decades, that ground was plowed and disked and subsoiled, and the artifacts were damaged. I'm sure there were buttons that were crushed completely by just the weight of the tractors and things running over clods that held them. All of this continued to happen because we relic hunters were not allowed to recover these artifacts and stop the process of corrosion and stop the damage by getting them out of the ground. Do you see any common sense in that policy? I don't. I thought they were supposed to be the preservers of our history. Looks to me like they're destroying it. And see, the thing is, they're not saying leave the artifacts there so that we can recover them. They have no plans to go on to do any of those digs on the private land around the parks. They can't handle what they've got on their plate now. So why do this? Why not let us have that? How is it going to hurt the government if we go out and dig fired bullets? They already have millions of them, of every kind made during the Civil War. Maybe on rare occasions, somebody might dig a bullet that nobody knows what it is. But you know what? I'm seeing that associating with the relic hunters, most of these people, the men and the women, are becoming really great historians, Civil War historians. And a lot of them know a lot more about the Civil War history than the rangers and the archaeologists do, because they have a passion for what they're doing, and to these other people, it's just a job. Okay, now, and you know what? They can argue, well, you detectorists, you don't know how to preserve these artifacts. I'll tell you what, I've gone to class in my Facebook group. I've had the guys that have been putting up videos about how to do electrolysis, how to preserve rust, how to get rust off of items, when to clean, when not to clean. It's like a college course, I'm telling you. So we're not ignoring preservation. We're all learning the techniques and things to do. This gun that Gary Persinger found, I mentioned, Gary is really good on electrolysis, and I can't wait to see that gun after he gets done, doing the electrolysis on it. It's going to be great. So what happens is another 100 years at the most, and probably a lot less, more like 50, the brass buttons are going to be gone. The brass fronts of the belt buckles and things are going to corrode away. The iron, many of the iron objects, spurs, stirrups, horse gear, even pieces of cannonball, things like that are going to eventually rust and fall apart. And there's no, like I said, there are no plans to remedy this situation. No suggestions. The archaeologists, they want the public to pay for everything they do. If you think they've got a useful job where and they get paid for hard work, everything they do comes from grants and contributions, and there's never enough money to do everything that needs to be done on the site. Now, common sense solution is to let the detectorists dig on the several hundred thousands of Civil War sites, which includes battlefields and camps, that the archaeologists can't cover. But let the detectorists respect the sites that the Archies are working on, respect the boundaries of the state and national battlefield parks, for example, by not attempting to detect them unless asked to do so by the professionals. That is the role that we have. Now, I want to give you an example of their inefficiency. I retired several years ago from a 44-year career in landscape construction and grounds maintenance for the super wealthy people. And I worked on a big farm in Walton, Kentucky called Richwood Farm. It had over 5,000 acres. It was the biggest farm in Boone County. And they had more John Deere equipment than any farm in the whole state of Kentucky. But they also had a very historic site on the farm. It belonged to a Revolutionary War colonel, fought in the Colonial Army, and it was a plantation. He had slave quarters in the back, and they had a separate summer kitchen that was not attached to the house. And the house burned in 1840. Summer kitchen is still standing today. Slave quarters were log cabins. They're gone. I know where they stood. Took some nice coins off those sites. People think the slaves didn't have anything to lose. Let me tell you, slave quarters sites are great hunt sites. If you're in an area in the South where they had slaves, it's no disrespect to the black people today to go hunt those sites. They're just another historical site, and you'll be amazed at what can be found on those sites. Now, Kentucky wanted to do a dig where the plantation house is set on this farm, on Richwood Farm. So they had to raise $30,000 in private donations before they could proceed. And they came in with 9 or 10 people, and they dug 30 test holes about 3 foot square and 3 foot deep, and they sifted all the dirt out of them. And they worked for 3 weeks, and they spent $30,000. That paid their salaries. And they found 3 or 4 pieces of old broken bottle glass, and I think they found 1 large cent. So when they got done, since I had access to the whole farm and I was allowed to detect on it, I decided to go over the area where they'd done their test digs. I popped 6 coins in the early 1800s in less than 2 hours. Now compare that to 10 people working 3 weeks for $30,000 and what they got. What could they have done if they'd had a crew of 5 or 6 metal detectors? They could have not only have hunted where the house sat itself, they could have hunted all around where the house sat. And they would have had metal artifacts, not just coins. You know, they'd have had everything, tools, horseshoes, everything that was around that. And they could have shown their investors a lot of results for a 3-week dig. Instead, they brought back 3 or 4 pieces of broken colored glass, maybe a couple pieces of plates, and this 1 coin, and bragging about how successful they were. I'm telling you, they're not living in the real world. There's not a successful business in the whole United States that ever ran that way. Now, you know, we've been treated, this thing of archaeologists versus metal detecting, it's like, it's like the Democrats and Republicans. Both sides want to say, hey, we're lily white, all of our programs are good, everything the other side's got is bad, right? Okay. It's been the same thing. The archaeologists want to say, there is no good in the metal detectors. They're all bad and we're all good. We're doing everything right, they're doing everything wrong. You know, we are the preservers of history. Well, took a trip down with a friend who was going down to a government auction at Fort Clark on the Tennessee-Kentucky border. And there was an archaeological park where an old town had stood, belonged to the state of Tennessee. And the superintendent was actually a degreed archaeologist, and he was the cousin of the guy I was with. So we stopped off to see him and talk to him. And of course, they didn't allow any metal detecting in the in the archaeological park. So he invited us to come to his house, which sat back in the woods on the edge of a big wooded cliff with a cave underneath it. And he had this big redwood house, fancy, about 3 stories with a lot of glass in it, very impressive. No lawn. It was all back in the woods, and the ground was covered with leaves and boulders and trees. And he had a nicely paved blacktop road driving back into a circle right in his front door. And so we go there and we go in the house, and he takes us over to a display case, and here are Indian skulls and bones from Indian graves with arrowheads sticking in them. Some of them have, damage from where they got hit in the head with a war club. This is his own personal collection, stolen off the sites he was working on. He was the grave robber. This was the archaeologist. He was the head of this whole park. And I saw with my own eyes. And they have the guts to call us grave robbers? If the Indians themselves found out about that park would have so many Indians demonstrating in it. And, he'd lose his job and that collection. But this is not an isolated incident. Let's skip across the big pond to Israel for a couple of minutes here. 2005, I was one of 65 American volunteers on a major archaeological excavation at what's called the Garden Tomb, near what many Christians believe is Golgotha, the site where Christ was crucified. Well, the Roman level, as we call it, that people in the time of Christ would have walked on, was an average of about 43 feet below the current ground level in the Garden Tomb garden. So we had to tunnel down like miners to get to the Roman level. And our crew, in 3 weeks, we excavated 44 tons of dirt and rock out of the Roman level, 43 feet below, uncovered a Roman crucifixion site on the side of Golgotha, not on the top, but on the side. It was a regular crucifixion site, so we think that's probably where all the action happened. But anyway, that's another story. Point was, I ran a sifting crew. I had a 9-person sifting crew I was in charge of, and we had to sift every rubber bucket full of dirt that came up through 3 different size screens. And we mucked that rock and dirt and risked our lives because not so much me, I was on the surface. I got to go down in the digs, but I didn't work down there. That was my first dig over there, and the guys that were digging down there wanted people that they knew, and they didn't know me. So anyway, I worked topside. And you just wouldn't believe it. The Israeli archaeologist and I got to be pretty good friends in charge of the dig. And he told me, he says, you American volunteers move 3 times as much dirt and rock as our own Israeli archaeological students. So I felt pretty good about that, take a little pride in that. We're setting a good example. But here's the kicker. We're mucking the dirt and rock out of that dig for the Israeli Antiquities Authority. And at that time, in 2005, each of us had paid $3,000 for the privilege of being part of this dig for 3 weeks. And I found out later that $600 of that $3,000 was paid to the Israeli Antiquities Authority so we could muck their rock and dirt. We were volunteer help, and they made us pay to do hard, dangerous manual labor because those diggers down there, there was 43 feet, there was about 37 feet of rubble, pieces of columns, stones, pottery, everything that came from the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans when they leveled the whole city in 69 or 70 AD. they just leveled it, and the new city since that time was built on top of the rubble. So that's why we had to tunnel down through this rubble, and it was in danger of collapsing down the diggers at any moment. Eventually, they safety engineers finally shored it up with steel beams and stuff. But we even had to sign. We had to get spatial insurance so that if we got killed on the dig, the Israelis wouldn't have to pay to ship our bodies home. That's how little we were thought of and the service we were performing. I came to have a friend that was highly connected with the political system in Israel. And to prove it to me, he called the Prime Minister of Israel on his cell phone right in front of me and talked to him just to show me how important he was. He got me in on a private tour of what's called the labs. And these belong to the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and they're not open to the public. And this is where they work on the really important finds they make. And I saw $20 million worth of Roman gold jewelry, exquisite earrings and necklaces, things like just take your breath away, and gold coins and rare silver coins being worked on with dental tools by all these technicians in this big room. And I got to see the warehouse where were all these different pots they'd put back together. And even the Romans had glass, and they made thin bottles. And when you find a Roman bottle that's 2,000 years old, you've got something worth a lot of money. But the point I'm making is all of that I saw will never see, the public will never see it. It will never be displayed in a museum. My inside sources tell me that what happens to all of that is that it's sold off by corrupt officials to private wealthy collectors around the world. So when these self-righteous people are pointing the finger at us and saying, you're the bad guys, and you're doing all the damage, you're destroying our history, they're only covering their own rotten tracks. Now, there are honest archaeologists, there are passionate archaeologists, and I don't want to cast dispersion on them. But I'm saying that the whole truth needs to come out. And a lot of that self-righteousness that this archaeological community has maintained all these years, all this false pride and vanity, that needs to stop. They need to realize that, okay, we got a few rotten apples in the detectorist barrel, and you got some rotten apples in the archaeologist barrel. Okay? Let's try to work around that and work together. But try making that little speech at your local archaeological meeting and see how much applause you get. Let's see. Now, another thing I want to cover, and this is happening a lot in the United States, a lot. Ask anybody that lives up in Northern Virginia, especially where the urban sprawl is taking over hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland for subdivisions and strip malls, so on. Sometimes when the excavation work begins on a strip mall site or something, an archaeological site will be exposed, ruins of an old burned house, building, or something, Civil War, whatever. And according to the laws, the contractor has to stop. Some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them try to hide it real quick, but others comply. And so the archaeologists end up getting as little as 3 weeks to totally explore these ruins or this archaeological site that's been discovered. And so they go in there and do, in 3 weeks, maybe 10% of the work that needs to be done, and then they have to get out, and that site disappears, as far as we're concerned, in our lifetimes forever, under concrete and structures. Excuse me. Now, had they, realizing they had such terrible time constraints, had they called in a volunteer team of artifact rescue detectorists, they might have, instead of getting 10% of what was on the site, they might have come out of it with 40 or 50% of what was there to find. And it wouldn't have cost the Archies a single penny out of their limited budgets. other than the fact they would have more artifacts they would have to store somewhere where nobody would see them. So these are the things that are the important issues when it comes to archaeology versus metal detecting. And I, will go to my grave maintaining that this army of detectorists that we have in this country could do and do actually do far more good than the comparatively small amount of plundering done by outlaw detectorists. Detectorists clean parks of dangerous trash, everything from drug syringes to you name it, and on it goes. We all, I think, know the benefits that all responsible detectorists provide to any place that they metal detect. I've been able to save farmers' cows because I found the mother trying to give birth and in distress, and I had permission to be on their farm looking for a Civil War camp. I went immediately to the house and told the farmer, and the farmer, of course, got on it, went out, and tied a cable to the back calf's hooves, and just pulled the calf out and saved the mama, and sometimes the calf. So, there's just so many ways. I consider myself extra security. If a man gives me permission, I'm out there in his fields. I'm an extra set of eyes. And if I see anything that's not right or anything that threatens anything he owns, I'm going to be squawking to him and telling him what's going on. And so we could also be an army of eyes and ears for the archaeologists. I know a relic hunter down in Alabama that was out walking the deep woods looking for Civil War site, and he stumbled into an incredible Indian artifact site. And there were ceremonial flint arrowheads, or actually ceremonial pieces, what they call museum quality, which means they're practically priceless, that were like 12 inches long and finely worked and all kinds of spatial stuff. And he got a couple of the pieces and packed them carefully, and he went to the Alabama authorities and told them about the site he'd found and showed them the couple of examples he'd brought back, which he turned over to them. Well, they were all excited. They said, "Would you take us back and show us the site?" He did, and he asked if he could have, if he could watch the archaeologists excavate it. That's all he was asking. They told him, "Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely." Got to the site, and once they knew where it was, immediately he was threatened with arrest and prosecution, told to get out, get off the site, and never come back. That's true story. So as long as this stuff is coming from the other side, these people are going to be responsible for our country losing, if not millions, hundreds of thousands of amazing artifacts. And one of the things that I like about the relic hunting community, they're the ones who take display cases of their collections to schools, and they teach the kids, they talk about the Civil War. They do a job that the archaeologists have no interest in doing. But they can't do that job unless they have artifacts to show. But the archaeologists would be more than happy just to get every artifact in our possessions, pack them up in boxes, and stick them in one of those big warehouses. So we get down to the bottom line here, and it's really this. If common sense could prevail in the archaeological community, we relic hunters would no longer be called grave robbers, but we'd be called artifact rescue specialists, as we deserve to be called. And because we would serve for free, millions of artifacts would be saved, and the Archies could still have their glory, only more so. It would be a win-win situation for both Archies and detectorists. All right, Mike, that's it.
What? You're done? Man, I was all into that. Good job. Really enjoyed that. Hey, something I want to tell you. Excuse me. I don't know if I ever told you this, but we had on. Oh, geez, you know how I've been with names tonight.
Yeah.
Oh man, I just had his name too. Greg Shipley on. And I don't know if you remember him, but I know you and I have talked. I've brought him up a few times. Incredible amateur archaeologist.
Oh yeah.
Out of Ohio.
Right.
When we had him on, he told us of an archaeological dig. And I don't want to misquote him, but it was an astronomical amount of money that they used through a grant. Are you there?
I am. I'm here.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened. We're good. I can hear you. Can you guys hear me? I just had something weird, a whole new screen pop up. Let me know if you guys can hear me. I think they can. I don't know. Boy, that was weird. You just never know with Skype and stuff what exactly is going on. But I'm going to assume they can hear me, even though nobody's responding. Yeah, they can hear me. Okay, there we go.
There we go.
I want to say it was something like $70,000, a $70,000 grant. It was up in northwestern Ohio. I think it was related to Matt Anthony Wayne. And like I said, I believe it was $70,000. I'd have to go back and listen. And I think if I recall right, they did a 3-day dig, and evidently they ran out of money then and came up with like 3, 4, 5 artifacts.
And they spent $70,000 in 3 days?
I don't hold me to that. It was something astronomical. I know I think Bill has listened to every single one. Maybe he can verify that for me, or maybe his memory, if he can remember. It was an astronomical amount of money that was blown through in just a few days, and only a few. How about that? And just a few artifacts were recovered. So I don't have any. I find that a lot of people in this hobby, it seems like they're scared of archaeologists and what the archaeologists think. And I have no respect for them. Now, if they show me some respect, if I ever meet that one that gives me a little bit of respect, can appreciate what I do, I'm great with them. Please don't misunderstand me. But the community as a whole, I have zero respect. I don't care what they think of me. I don't care what they say. We've had some other people on, and I'm trying to think of the other name that was talking about archaeologists and just painted them and such. Had quite a bit of to do with them in the past, and just their train of thought, and pretty much what I took away from that conversation is archaeologists look down on people in general. They're academics that are better than us. And I'm sure not all are like that, and I know that there's some good. I have heard in a couple instances detectorists working with archaeologists that were wonderful, so it happens. But I think if you detect and archaeologist comes up, I don't know why anybody would feel like, they need to explain to them or, put their head down, so to speak. They're nobody special. They're nobody to look up to or worry about what they think about you or me or us that metal detect, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I would say to anybody, any detectorist, if you can save a relic from the ground without breaking the law, my hat's off to you.
Yes.
But just remember that relic might take some preservation that you don't know how to do. And if you don't know how to do it, seek advice, because there's somebody in the detecting community that can give you the knowledge you need.
Yes. Absolutely, I agree. Very important. And I see a lot of people, know of a lot of people who, you know, it's always blown my mind that people will put a lot of time in research and go spend gas and travel all day or several days or a week or more, spend all this money, all this time put into it, bring home these great finds and throw them in a bucket with everything else. And
Yeah.
I think they deserve better. I think you've earned that, and there's a whole nother step you're leaving out by recording those. And for future generations, that's fine if you can reach in that bucket and say where every one of those finds come. But the minute you pass, nobody else can. Label
Yeah.
them and put them in
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
display. It just goes to, it goes back to that whole thing. Something I always try to explain to somebody. Context is so important. It's so important. You take a square cut nail. How many square cut nails have you found, or how many have I found? Piles of them, right? I mean,
Oh
probably
yeah,
enough to fill
absolutely.
up a pickup truck.
Yeah.
But you take one good example of a square cut nail and you say, I found it at this ghost town that predated the maps, was very significant, but also one of the earliest in the state or that region of the state, and disappeared because of this. You just added value to that square cut nail. Now it might not be much, and we, I don't know anybody personally that is in this hobby for monetary gain, but look at it as historical, how important it is to label those finds. You can have, I mean, we all have them. I've got a case, actually two cases of stuff that really there's nothing particularly special in any of them except where they came from. And they came from a town, just like I said, one of the earliest in the region, long gone. I mean, I think it was gone by 1830s. That's early for Ohio, for that part of Ohio too. It started before Ohio was a state. And I think you take those same finds and put them in a bucket, and there's maybe a few dollars worth of value on the coins, but not knowing where they came from or anything. There's no value. There's no historical value. There's no monetary value. But yet you put them in a case and you tell the story of where they came from, and now there's historical value. Well, Dorian's yawning on me, so I must be rattling
Uh-oh.
on too much.
Uh-oh. No, it's okay. I'm all right.
Yeah.
Uh,
Now, I know that's off the subject, but I think that's always an important thing to remind people. I hate when somebody tries to, have you ever gone to somebody's house for the first time in metal detecting, and they take you down in their basement and they show you their buckets of old coins and buttons and buckles and stuff?
yeah.
It makes me
Yeah.
want to cry.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
It just makes me want to cry. One thing before we go, we can't get off of here until you got one other task.
Yep. Yeah.
He
Okay.
didn't forget
Well,
you, Bill.
let's check see if anybody else has any comments or questions before we go to the treasure story. I got a dilly for you tonight, Bill.
Oh boy, I can't wait.
Okay. Nobody throwing
If
out any
anybody has a
questions?
question, you want to, got anything to add, say, get it out now. Now's a good time. Before we go into the story, once we get through the story, that's it. We're calling it a night. I think we're good. Yeah, they're all saying treasure story.
Okay, treasure story. All right. How about a Knights of the Golden Circle treasure story?
Oh, absolutely. Now this isn't
Uh,
the Columbus one, right?
you never heard this one.
Okay.
Nobody's heard this one. Okay.
I mean, Dorian, I gotta tell you,
Yeah.
You're real good about repeating yourself, and the only reason I feel comfortable saying that is because I'm considerably younger and I forget and I repeat myself. So I was just making sure it wasn't the Columbus one. That's all, because I know we've told that one. Bill was interested in that one. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, you're talking about the one the Golden Circle treasure buried in the Capitol
Yes.
grounds.
Yep.
Yeah, no, this is not. This is I'm going to take you all the way out to Missouri on this one.
Oh.
Okay, nobody's heard this one. This is a true story. Told to me by the two guys involved in it that were personal friends. Um, they got on to a lead involved a wagon load of KGC gold that was being transported to a cache, and the federal cavalry got on the trail, and the uh, rear guard, the guy on horseback that was guarding the rear of the wagon deal, spotted the cavalry coming and came to them. And nearby was a kind of a bluff that dropped off about 100 feet or so. And near the bluff was a crevice about less than a foot wide. And so the guards with the train went back and they fought a delaying action with the Yankee cavalry, stopped them out of sight. And the guys on the wagon unloaded the bars and they dropped them down this crevice. So they went down about 100 feet or so into this crevice. Well, these two treasure hunters out of San Diego that I knew that were friends of Charlie Garrett's, they got onto this site and they found the crevice. And they could actually see, with strong lights, they could see there were gold bars. Now, there was a problem. This site was in a national forest. So they went to the government. And here's what, at the time, I don't know if they've changed this because I haven't kept up with it the last few years. But the way it worked on a situation like this was you submitted a request for a treasure hunting permit and you had to give all the details of the treasure and why you thought there was a treasure on federal land. Well, if you were stupid and you gave all the details, your request for a permit would be turned down and then the feds would just go dig up the treasure. These guys weren't that smart. They gave them just enough details, to give the impression, well, we've got to look for this and find it. Well, the feds are happy in that case to let you look and find the treasure, but they don't intend for a minute that you actually get the treasure or get any value out of it. And any agreement they make to split it, it's not, like I said, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Anyway, they got their permit and they were given 2 weeks, 2-week permit. So they realized what they were going to have to do. They couldn't figure out any way to get to the gold bars, this little tiny narrow crevice and all this hard limestone rock. So they brought in a backhoe and they started digging down beside at the bottom until they got to the level where the gold bars were. And then they were going to widen the crevice enough to get back into the bars because the bars were not very far from the edge of the cliff. They were back in about 6 feet, I think. So they got down and they got the crevice cleaned out. They had a big pit dug and had the backhoe down in there. And there wasn't any rain predicted. They hadn't had any problems the whole week. And suddenly this black cloud boiled up over top of them, and it just a cloudburst came down on them. And the backhoe driver barely got the backhoe out of the hole before the hole flooded. Well, the problem was it took almost a week for the water to go down to where they could get the backhoe back in there and finish a little bit of work they had to do. And their permit expired. So part of the deal was they had to fill the excavation back in, and they couldn't get the jackhammer, get the crevice wide enough to get to the gold bars. So they had to fill the whole site back in, and then they had to apply for another permit for another 2 weeks. Well, you can imagine this was considerably expensive for them to do all this. but they were turned down the second time. They did not, the government refused to renew their permit. So they packed up everything and left. And 2 weeks later, these two guys snuck back into the area in camouflage and got up to the top of the bluff and looked over, and here was an army crew down there with a backhoe finishing the work they started. So you know who got the treasure.
Yikes. That's awful nice of them, huh?
Yep. So, but it also illustrates a point. I mean, that story ties right in with what I was saying tonight. That you just can't, when these archaeologists and historians get in high positions with the government, state or federal, most of them are very much driven to advance themselves, and that's all they're really concerned about. And they will lie to you. They will violate an agreement. They'll stab you in the back, as the old saying goes. There are exceptions, but I'm just saying, if you deal with them, you'd better be on guard and alert, because the odds are you're going to have those kind of problems, not that you're going to get somebody who's going to deal completely fairly and honestly with you.
Wow. That is crazy. Yeah, I don't know of a situation where I would ever trust the government. I'll tell you something. I probably wouldn't say this if he was still alive, but my dad always used to say, as a small businessman, if you don't screw the government, and he didn't actually use that word, he said you can't make it. And I was always brought up, you don't trust the government. And I learned firsthand when I worked for the government for a while. I could tell you horror stories. I'll tell you sometime some of the stuff, Dorian, that just blew my mind. I maybe have already told you, but go ahead.
Oh, well, again, I know people. I got people in our group that are former government employees, and some of them don't speak very well of the government at all. And I thought, well, you guys be on the inside, But here's the point. I don't want to be like them. They brand all of us as grave robbers. I don't want to follow in their footsteps. I want to try to judge each official I deal with based on their own merits. But at the same time, my historical experience over the last 40 years with people in these positions has not built a lot of confidence in me to just give them my trust right off the bat. Right. They're going to have to earn it.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree 100%. I've talked to too many people and heard too many stories to trust. And I don't know. I agree. Well, are we ready to wrap it up, Dorian?
That's all I've got. Unless anything else you want to bring up.
No, I'm good. I am good. I think it was a great show, great story. Shame that cache is gone, but I'm sure it's sitting at Fort Knox probably.
Actually, no. All the Fort Knox gold, there's an underground railroad that the public doesn't know about that goes to the gold vaults, and all of the gold has been moved out of Fort Knox, and what's in those cells is gold-plated plastic bars. They don't let anybody touch them, so they look real because they're gold-plated. But I even had the name of the factory where they were made in Canada at one time in my files.
Really?
Yeah, I had a close friend who was actually head of the Gold Commission for the U.S. government under one of the presidents, which I won't mention. I don't want to cause any problems for his family, but they ended up murdering him in 1987. But he told me he was involved. He knew all about the gold reserve supplies and everything, and he told me about the secret railroad underneath and how it had been used.
Hey! I don't need any guys in black suits come and visit me, Dorian.
Well, I'll tell you what. We'll try to keep it down to the black helicopters.
You know one thing, I look so dumb that that guy's dumber than a box of rocks. We're okay. He don't know. And I'll just stand there and I don't know what's going on. You throw a little drool down the side of your chin. You're fine. Yeah, you're fine.
Oh boy.
I'm
Yeah,
okay,
well,
but
that's okay until FEMA institutes their useless eaters program.
right. Okay, let's wrap it up. It's getting too scary now. Dorian, thanks for sharing all that with us. What a great show. I hope you all enjoyed it. Tune in next week. I'm not sure did we figure out what we're going to do next week?
Yeah, we're going to try to have a show that everybody will want to listen to.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go with that. Tune in next Tuesday. Of course, you got Amanda and Gypsy next Monday night. Make sure you tune in then, and we'll see y'all next week. Have a great week, and thanks for tuning in.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.